The Man Who Died by D.H. Lawrence. Part 2. The wind came cold and strong from the inland, from the invisible snows of Lebanon, but the temple, facing south and west, towards Egypt, faced the splendid sun of winter as he curved down towards the sea. The warmth and radiance flooded in between the pillars of painted wood. But the sea was invisible because of the trees, though its dashing sounded among the hum of pines. The air was turning golden to afternoon. The woman who served Isis stood in her yellow robe and looked up at the steep slopes coming down to the sea, where the olive trees silvered under the wind like water splashing. She was alone save for the goddess. And in the winter afternoon the light stood erect and magnificent off the invisible sea, filling the hills of the coast. She went towards the sun, though the grove of the Mediterranean pine trees and evergreen oaks, in the midst of which the temple stood, on a little tree-covered tongue of land between two bays. It was only a very little way, and then she stood among the dry trunks of the outermost pines, on the rocks under which the sea smote and sucked, facing the open where the bright sun gloried in the water, in winter. The sea was dark, almost indigo, running away from the land, and crested with white. The hand of the wind brushed it strangely with shadow as it brushed the olives of the slopes with silver, and there was no boat out. The three boats were drawn high up on the steep shingle of the little bay, by the small gray tower. Along the edge of the shingle ran a high wall, inside which was the garden occupying a brief flat of the bay, then rising in terraces up the steep slope of the coast. And there, some little way up, within another wall, stood the low white villa, white and alone as the coast, overlooking the sea. But higher, much higher up, where the olives had given way to pine trees again, ran the coast road, keeping to the height to be above the gullies that came down to the bays. Upon it all poured the royal sunshine of the January afternoon, or rather, all was part of the great sun, glow and substance and immaculate loneliness of the sea, and pure brightness. Crouching in the rocks above the dark water, which only swung up and down, two slaves, half naked, were dressing pigeons for the evening meal. They pierced the throat of a blue, live bird, and let the drops of blood fall into the heaving sea with curious concentration. They were performing some sacrifice, or working in some incantation. The woman of the temple, yellow and white, and alone, like a winter Narcissus, stood between the pines of the small humped peninsula where the temple secretly hid, and watched. A black and white pigeon, vividly white, like a ghost, escaped over the low dark sea, sped out, caught the wind, tilted, rode, soared, and swept over the pine trees, and wheeled away, a speck, inland. It had escaped. The priestess heard the cry of the boy slave, a garden slave of about 17. He raised his arms to heaven in anger as the pigeon wheeled away. Naked and angry and young, he held out his arms. Then he turned and seized the girl in an access of rage, and beat her with his fist that was stained with pigeon's blood, and she lay down with her face hidden, passive and quivering. The woman who owned them watched, and as she watched, she saw another onlooker, a stranger, in a low, broad hat, and a cloak of gray homespun, a dark-bearded man, standing on the little causeway of a rock that was the neck of her temple peninsula. By the blowing of his dark gray cloak she saw him, and he saw her, on the rocks like a white and yellow narcissus, because of the flutter of her white linen tunic below the yellow mantle of wool, and both of them watched the two slaves. The boy suddenly left off beating the girl. He crouched over her, touching her, trying to make her speak. But she lay quite inert, face down on the smoothed rock, and he put his arms around her and lifted her. But she slipped back to earth like one dead, yet too farly quickly for anything dead. The boy, desperate, caught her by the hips and hugged her to him, turning her over there. There she seemed inert. All her fight was in her shoulders. He twisted her over, intent and unconscious, and pushed his hands between her thighs to push them apart. In an instant he was covering the blind, frightened frenzy of the boy's first passion. Quick in frenzies, his young body Quick and frenzied, his young body quivered naked on hers, blind for a minute. Then it lay quite still, as if dead. And then, in terror, he peeped up. He peeped around and drew slowly to his feet, adjusting his loin rag. He saw the stranger, and then he saw, on the rocks beyond, the lady of Isis, his mistress. And as he saw her, her whole body shrank and cowed. And with a strange, cringing motion, he scuttled lamely towards the door in the wall. The girl sat up and looked after him. When she had seen him disappear, she too looked around. And she saw the stranger and the priestess. Then with a sullen movement she turned away, as if she had been nodding, or as if she had seen nothing, to the 4 dead pigeons and the knife, which lay there on the rock. And she began to strip the small feathers so that they rose on the wind like dust. The priestess turned away. Slaves! Let the overseer watch them. She was not interested. She went slowly through the pines again, back to the temple, which stood in the sun in a small clearing at the center of the tongue of land. It was a small temple of wood, painted all pink and white and blue, having at the front 4 wooden pillars, rising like stems to the swollen lotus bud of Egypt at the top. Supporting the roof and open, spiky lotus flowers of the outer frieze, which went round under the eaves. 2 low steps of stone led up to the platform before the pillars, and the chamber behind the pillars was open. There a low stone altar stood, with a few embers in its hollow, and the dark stain of blood in its end groove. She knew her temple well, for she had built it at her own expense, and tended it for 7 years. There it stood, pink and white, like a flower in the little clearing, backed by blackish evergreen oaks, and the shadow of the afternoon was already washing over its pillar bases. She entered slowly, passing through to the dark inner chamber, lighted by a perfumed oil flame. And once more she pushed the door shut, and once more she threw a few grains of incense on a brazier before the goddess, and once more she sat down before her goddess, in the almost darkness, to muse, to go away into the dreams of the goddess. It was Isis, but not Isis, mother of Horus. It was Isis bereaved, Isis in search. The goddess, in painted marble, lifted her face and strode, one thigh forward through the frail fluting of her robe, in the anguish of bereavement and of search. She was looking for the fragments of the dead Osiris, dead and scattered asunder, dead, torn apart, and thrown in fragments over the wide world. And she must find his hands and his feet, his heart, his thighs, his head, his belly. She must gather him together and fold her arms round the reassembled body till it became warm again, and roused to life, and could embrace her, and could fecundate her womb. And the strange rapture and anguish of search went on through the years, as she lifted her throat and her hollowed eyes looked inward, in the tormented ecstasy of seeking, and in the delicate navel of her bud-like belly showed through the frail, girdled robe with the eternal asking of her search. And through the years she found him bit by bit, heart and head and limbs and body, and yet she had not found the last reality, the final clue to him. That alone could bring him really back to her. For she was Isis of the subtle lotus, the womb which waits and was submerged in bud, waits for the touch of that other inward sun that streams its rays from the loins of the male Osiris. This was the mystery the woman had served alone for 7 years, since she was 20. Till now she was 27. Before, when she was young, she had lived in the world, in Rome, in Ephesus, in Egypt, for her father had been one of Antony's captains and comrades, had fought with Antony and had stood with him when Caesar was murdered, and through to the days of shame. Then he had come across to Asia out of favor with Rome, and had been killed in the mountains beyond Lemedon. The widow, having no favor to hope for from Octavius, had retired to her small property on the coast under Lemedon, taking her daughter from the world, a gift of 19, beautiful but unmarried. When she was young, the girl had known Caesar, and had shrunk from his eagle-like rapacity. The golden Antony had sat with her many a half-hour, in the splendor of his great limbs and glowing manhood, and talked with her of the philosophies and the gods. For he was fascinated as a child by the gods, though he mocked at them, and forgot forgot them in his own vanity. But he said to her, I have sacrificed 2 doves for you, to Venus, for I am afraid you make no offering to the sweet goddess. Beware you will offend her. Come, why is the flower of you so cool within? Does never a ray nor a glance find its way through? Ah, come, a maid should open to the sun, when the sun leans towards her to caress her. And the big bright eyes of Anthony laughed down on her, bathing her in his glow. And she felt the lovely glow of his male beauty and amorousness bathe all her limbs and her body. But it was as he said. The very flower of her womb was cool, was almost cold, like a bud in the shadow of frost, for all the flooding of his sunshine. So Anthony, respecting her father, who loved her, had left her. And it had always been the same. She saw many men, young and old, and on the whole she liked the old ones best, for they talked to her still and sincere, and did not expect her to open like a flower to the sun of their maleness. Once she asked a philosopher, Are all women born to be given to men? To which the old man answered slowly, Rare women wait for the reborn man. For the lotus, as you know, will not answer to the bright heat of the sun, but she curves her dark hidden head in the depths and stirs not, till in the night one of these rare invisible suns that have been killed and shine no more rises among the stars in unseen purple, and like the violet sends its rare purple rays out into the night. To these the lotus stirs as to a caress, and rises upwards through the flood, and lifts her bent head, and opens with an expansion such as no other flower knows, and spreads her sharp rays of bliss, and offers her soft gold depths as no other flower possesses, to the penetration of the flooding violet dark sun that has died and risen and makes no show. But for the golden brief day suns of show, such as Anthony, and for the hard winter suns of power, such as Caesar, the lotus stirs not, nor will never stir. Those will only tear open the bud. Ah, I tell you, wait for the reborn, and wait for the bud to stir. So she had waited, for all the men were soldiers or politicians in the Roman spell, assertive, manly, splendid apparently, but of an inward meanness and inadequacy. And Rome and Egypt alike had left her alone, unroused, and she was a woman to herself. She would not give herself for a surface glow, nor marry for reasons. She would wait for the lotus to stir. And then, in Egypt, she had found Isis, in whom she spelled her mystery. She had brought Isis to the shores of Sidon, and lived with her in the mystery of search, whilst her mother, who loved affairs, controlled the small estate and the slaves with a free hand. When the woman had roused from her muse, and risen to perform the last brief ritual to Isis, she replenished the lamp and left the sanctuary, locking the door. In the outer world the sun had already set, and twilight was chill among the humming trees, which hummed still, though the wind was abating. A stranger in a dark, broad hat rose from the corner of the temple steps, holding his hat in the wind. He was dark-faced, with a black pointed beard. "Oh, madam, whose shelter may I implore?" he said to the woman, who stood in her yellow mantle on a step above him, beside a pink and white painted pillar. Her face was rather long and pale. Her dusky blonde hair was held under a thin gold net. She looked down on the vagabond with indifference. It was the same she had seen watching the slaves. "Why come you down from this road?" she asked. "I saw the temple like a pale flower on the coast, and would rest among the trees and precincts, if the lady of the goddess permits." "It is Isis in search," she said, answering his first question. "The goddess is great," he replied. She looked at him still with mistrust. There was a faint remote smile in his dark eyes lifted to her, though the face was hollow with suffering. The vagabond divined her hesitation and was mocking her. "Stay here upon the steps," she said. "A slave will show you to the shelter. The Lady of Egypt is gracious." She went down the rocky path of the humped peninsula in her glided sandals. Beautiful were her ivory feet beneath the white tunic, and above the saffron mantle her dusky blonde head bent as with endless musings. A woman entangled in her own dream. The man smiled a little, half bitterly, and sat again on the step to wait, drawing his mantle round him in the cold twilight. At length a slave appeared, also in hodden grey. "Seek ye the shelter of Our Lady?" he said insolently. "Even so. Then come." With the brusque insolence of a slave waiting on a vagabond, the young fellow led through the trees and down into a little gully in the rock, where, almost in darkness, was a small cave with a litter of tall heaths that grew on the waste places of the coast under the stone pines. The place was dark, but absolutely silent from the wind. There was still a faint odor of goats. "Here, sleep," said the slave, "for the goats come no more on this half-island. And there is water." He pointed to a little basin of rock where the maidenhair fern fringed a dripping mouthful of water. Having scornfully bestowed his patronage, the slave departed. The man who had died climbed out to the tip of the peninsula where the waves thrashed. It was rapidly getting dark, and the stars were coming out. The wind was abating for the night. Inland, the steep grooved upslope was dark to the long wavering outline of the crest of the translucent sky. Only now and then a lantern flickered towards the villa. The man who had died went back to the shelter. There he took bread from his leather pouch, dipped it in the water of the tiny spring, and slowly ate. Having eaten and washed his mouth, he looked once more at the bright stars and the pure windy sky, then settled for the heath for his bed. Having laid his hat and his sandals aside, and put his pouch under his cheek for a pillow, he slept, for he was very tired. Yet during the night the cold woke him, pinching wearily through his weariness. Outside was a brilliantly starry and still windy. He sat and hugged himself in a sort of coma, and towards dawn went to sleep again. In the morning the coast was still chill in shadow, though the sun was up behind the hills, when the woman came down from the villa towards the goddess. The sea was fair and pale blue, lovely in newness, and at last the wind was still. Yet the waves broke white in the many rocks, and tore in the shingle of the little bay. The woman came slowly towards her dream, yet she was aware of an interruption. As she followed the little neck of rock onto her peninsula and climbed the slope between the trees to the temple, a slave came down and stood, making her his obeisance. There was a faint insolence in his humility. "Speak," she said. "Lady, the man is there. He still sleeps. Lady, may I speak?" "Speak," she said, repelled by the fellow. "Lady, the man is an escaped malefactor." The slave seemed triumphant in imparting the unpleasant news. "By what sign? Behold his hands and feet. Will the lady look on him? Lead on." The slave led quickly over the mound of the hill down to the tiny ravine. There he stood aside, and the woman went into the crack towards the cave. Her heart beat a little. Above all, she must preserve her temple inviolate. The vagabond was asleep with his cheek on his scrip, his mantle wrapped around him, but his bare, soiled feet curling by side to keep each other warm, and his hand lying loosely clenched in sleep. And in the pale skin of his feet, usually covered by sandal straps, she saw the scars, and in the palm of the loose hand. She had no interest in men, particularly in the servile class, yet she looked at the sleeping face. It was worn, hollow, and rather ugly. But, a true priestess, she saw the other kind of beauty in it, the sheer stillness of the deeper life. There was even a sort of majesty in the dark brows over the long, still, hollow cheeks. She saw that his black hair, left long in contrast to the Roman fashion, was touched with gray at the temples, and the black pointed beard had threads of gray. But that must be suffering or misfortune, for the man was still young. His dusky skin had the silvery glisten of the youth still. There was a beauty of much suffering, and the strange calm candor of his finer life, and the whole delicate ugliness of the face. For the first time she was touched on the quick at the sight of a man, as if the tip of a fine flame of living had touched her. It was the first time. Men had roused all kinds of feeling in her, but had never touched her with the flame tip of life. She went back under the rock to where the slave waited. "No," she said, "this is no malefactor, but a free citizen of the East. Do not disturb him. But when he comes forth, bring him to me. Tell him I would like to speak to him." She spoke coldly, for the found slaves, invariably repellent, a little repulsive. They were so embedded in the lesser life, and their appetites and their small consciousness were a little disgusting. So she wrapped her dream round her, and went to the temple, where a slave girl brought brought winter roses and jasmine for the altar. But today, even in her ministrations, she was disturbed. The sun rose over the hill, sparkling. The light fell triumphantly on the pine-covered peninsula of the coast, and on the pink temple in the pristine newness. The man who had died woke up and put on his sandals. He put on his hat, too, slung his scrip under his mantle, and went out, to see the morning in all its blue and new gold. He glanced at the little yellow and white narcissus speaking gaily in the rocks. And then he saw the slave waiting for him like a menace. "Master," said the slave, Our Lady would speak with you at the house of Isis." "It is well," said the wanderer. He went slowly, staying to look at the pale blue sea like a flower in unruffled bloom, and the white fringes among the rocks, like white rock flowers, the hollow slopes sheering up high from the shore, gray with olive trees and green with bright young wheat, and set with the white small villa, all fair and pure in the January morning. The sun fell on the corner of the temple. He sat down on the step in sunshine, and in the infinite patience of waiting. He had come back to life, but not the same life that he had left. The life of little people in the little day. Reborn, he was in the other life, the greater day of the human consciousness. And he was alone and apart from the little day, and out of contact with the daily people. Not yet had he accepted the irrevocable noli me tangere, which separates the reborn from the vulgar. The separation was absolute. As yet at the temple he felt peace, the hard, bright pagan peace with hostility of slaves beneath. The woman came into the dark inner doorway of the temple, from the shrine, and stood there, hesitating. She could see the dark figure of the man, sitting in that terrible stillness that was portentous to her, had something almost menacing in its patience. She advanced across the outer chamber of the temple, and the man, becoming aware of her, stood up. She addressed him in Greek, but he said, "Madam, my Greek is limited. Allow me to speak vulgar Syrian." "Whence come you? Whither go you?" she asked, with the hurried preoccupation of a priestess. "From the east beyond Damascus, and I go west as the road goes," he replied slowly. She glanced at him with sudden anxiety and shyness. "But why do you have the marks of a malefactor?" she asked abruptly. "Did the Lady of Isis spy upon me in my sleep?" he asked with a grey weariness. The slave warned me. "Your hands and feet," she said. He looked at her. Then he said, "Will the Lady of Isis allow me to bid her farewell and go up the road?" The wind came in a sudden puff, lifting his mantle and his hat. He put up his hand to hold the brim, and she saw again the thin brown hand with its scar. "See, the scar," she said, pointing. "Even so," he said, "but farewell, and to Isis my homage, and my thanks for sleep." He was going, but she looked up at him with her wandering blue eyes. "Will you not look at Isis?" she said, with sudden impulse, and something stirred in him, like pain. "Where then?" he said. "Come." He followed her into the inner shrine, into the almost darkness. When his eyes got used to the faint glow of the lamp, he saw the goddess striding like a ship, eager in the swirl of her gown, and he made his obeisance. "Great is Isis," he said. In her search, she is greater than death. Wonderful is such walking in a woman. Wonderful the goal. All men praise thee, Isis, thou greater than the mother unto man." The woman of Isis heard, and threw incense on the brazier. Then she looked at the man. "Is it well with thee here?" she asked. "Has Isis brought thee home to herself?" He looked at the priestess in wonder and trouble. "I know not," he said. But the woman was pondering that this was the lost Osiris. She felt in the quick of her soul, and her agitation was intense. She would not stay in the close, dark, perfumed shrine. He went out again to the morning, to the cold air. He felt something approaching to touch him, and all his flesh was still woven with pain and the wild commandment, "Noli me tangere, touch me not. Oh, don't touch me." The woman followed into the open with timid eagerness. He was moving away. "Oh, stranger, do not go. Oh, stay a while with Isis." He looked at her face open like a flower, as if a sun had risen in her soul. And again his loins stirred. "Would you detain me, girl of Isis?" he said. "Stay. I am sure you are Osiris," she said. He laughed suddenly. "Not yet," he said. Then he looked at her wistful face. "But I will sleep another night in the cave of the goats, if Isis wills it," he added. She put her hands together with a priestess's child happiness. "Ah, Isis will be glad," she said. So he went down to the shore in great trouble, saying to himself, Shall I give myself into this touch? Shall I give myself into this touch? Men have tortured me to death with their touch, yet this girl of Isis is the tender flame of healing. I am a physician, yet I have no healing like the flame of this tender girl. The flame of this tender girl! Like the first pale crocus of the spring. How could I have been blind to the healing and the bliss of the crocus-like body of a tender woman? Ah, tenderness! More terrible and lovely than the death I died. He pried small shellfish from the rocks, and ate them with relish and wonder for the simple taste of the sea. And inwardly he was tremulous, thinking, Dare I come into touch? For this is further than death. I have dared to let them lay hands on me and put me to death. But dare I come into this tender touch of life? Oh, this is harder. But the woman went into the shrine again, and sat wrapped in pure muse. Through the long hours, watching the swirling stride of the yearning goddess, and the navel of the bud-like belly, like a seal on the virgin urge of the search. And she gave herself to the woman flow and to the urge of Isis in search. Towards sundown she went to the peninsula to look for him, and she found him gone towards the sun, as she had gone the day before. And sitting on the pine needles at the foot of the tree, where she had stood when first she saw him. Now she approached tremulously and slowly, afraid lest he did not want her. She stood near him unseen, till suddenly he glanced up at her from under his broad hat, and saw the westering sun on her nettled hair. He was startled, yet he expected her. "Is that your home?" he said, pointing towards the white low villa on the slope of olives. "It is my mother's house. She is a widow, and I am her only child." "And are these all her slaves?" "Except those that are mine." Their eyes met for a moment. "Will you two sit in the sun go down? Will you two sit to see the sun go down?" he said. He had not risen to speak to her. He had known too much pain. So she sat on the dry brown pine needles, gathering her saffron mantle round her knees. A boat was coming in, out of the open glow into the shadow of the bay, and slaves were lifting small nets, their babble coming off the surface of the water. "And this is home to you," he said. "But I serve Isis in search," she replied. But he looked at her. She was like a soft, musing cloud, somehow remote. His soul smote him with passion and compassion. "Mayst thou find thy desire, maiden," he said, with sudden earnestness. "And art thou not Osiris?" she asked. He flushed suddenly. "Yes, if thou wilt heal me," he said, for the death aloofness is still upon me, and I cannot escape it." She looked at him for a moment in fear, from the soft blue sun of her eyes. Then she lowered her head, and they sat in silence in the warmth and glow of the western sun, the man who had died, and the woman in the purest search. The sun was curving down to the sea in grand winter splendor. It fell on the twinkling naked bodies of the slaves, with their ruddy broad hams and their small black heads, as they ran spreading the nets on the pebble beach. The all-tolerant Pan watched over them. All-tolerant Pan should be their god forever. The woman rose as the sun's rim dipped, saying, "If you will stay, I shall send down victual and covering." "The lady your mother, what will she say?" The woman of Isis looked at him strangely, but with a tinge of misgiving. "It is my own," she said. "It is good," he said, smiling faintly, and foreseeing difficulties. He watched her go with her absorbed, strange motion of the of the self-delicate. He watched her go with her absorbed, strange motion of the self-dedicate. Her dun head was a little bent, the white linen swung about her ivory ankles, and he saw the naked slave stand to look at her, with a certain wonder and even a certain mischief. But she passed intent through the door in the wall on the bay. The man who had died sat at the front of the tree, overlooking the strand, for on the little shore everything happened. At the small stream which ran around the corner of the property wall, women slaves were still washing linen, and now and again came the hollow chock, 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 as they beat it against the smooth stones. In the dark little hollow of the pool, there was a smell of olive refuse in the air, and sometimes still the faint rumble of the grindstone was milling the olives inside the garden, and the sound of the slave calling to the ass at the mill. Then through the doorway a woman stepped, a gray-haired woman in a mantle of whitish wool, and there followed her a bare-headed man in a toga, a Roman, probably her steward or overseer. They stood on the high shingle above the sea, and cast round a rapid glance. The broad-hammed, ruddy-bodied slaves bent, absorbed and abject over the nets, picking them clean. The women washing linen thrust their palms with energy down on the wash. The old slave bent, absorbed at the water's edge, washing the fish and the polyps of the catch. And the woman and the overseer saw it all in one glance. They also saw, seated at the foot of the tree on the rocks of the peninsula, the strange man silent and alone. And the man who had died saw that they spoke of him. Out of the little sacred world of the peninsula, he looked on the common world, and saw it still hostile. The sun was touching the sea. Across the tiny bay stretched the shadow of opposite humped headland. Over the shingle, now blue and cold in shadow, the elderly woman trod heavily, in shadow too, to look at the fish spread in the flat basket of the old man crouching at the water's edge. A naked old slave with fat hips and shoulders, on whose soft, fairish orange body was the last sun twinkled, then died. The old slave continued cleaning the fish absorbedly, not looking up, as if the lady were the shadow of twilight falling on him. Then from the gateway stepped two slave girls with flat baskets on their heads, and from one basket the terracotta wine jar and the oil jar poked up, leaning slightly. Over the massive shingle under the wall came the girls, and the woman of Isis in her saffron mantle stepped in twilight after them. Out at sea the sun still shone. Here was shadow. The mother with gray head stood at the sea's edge and watched the daughter, all yellow and white, with dun blonde head, swinging unseeing and unheeding after the slave girls, towards the neck of the rock of the peninsula, the daughter traveling in her absorbed otherworld. And not moving from her place, the elderly mother watched that procession of the tree file up the rise of the headland between the trees and disappear, shut in by trees. No slave had lifted a head to look. The gray-haired woman still watched the trees where her daughter had disappeared. Then she glanced again at the foot of the Spicius now, for the sun had left him, and only the far blade of the sea shone bright. It was evening. Patience! Let destiny move. The mother plodded with a stamping stride up the shingle, not long and swinging and rapt like the daughter, but short and determined. Then down the rock opposite of the two naked slaves, trotting with huge bundles of dark green on their shoulders, so their broad, naked legs twinkled underneath like insects' legs, and their heads were hidden. They came trotting across the shingle, heedless and intent on their way, when suddenly the man, the Roman-looking overseer, addressed them, and they stopped dead. They stood invisible under their loads, as if they might disappear altogether. Now they were arrested. Then a hand came out and pointed to the peninsula. Then the two green-heaped slaves trotted on, towards the temple precincts. The gray-haired woman joined the man, and slowly the two passed through the door again, from the shingle of the sea to the property of the villa. Then the old, fat-shouldered slave rose, pallid in the shadow, with his tray of fish from the sea, and the woman rose from the pool, dusky and alive, piling the wet linen in a heap onto the flat baskets. And the slaves who had cleaned the net gathered its whitish folds together. And the old slave with the fish basket on his shoulder, and the women slaves who heaped baskets of wet linen on their heads, and the two slaves with the folded net, and the slave with oars on his shoulders, and the boy with the folded sail on his arm, gathered in a naked group near the door, and the man who had died heard the low buzz of their chatter. Then, as the wind wafted cold, they began to pass through the door. It was the life of the little day, the life of little people, and the man who had died said to himself, "Unless we encompass it in the greater day, and set the little life in the circle of greater life, all is disaster." Even the tops of the hills were in shadow. Only the sky was still upwardly radiant. The sea was a vast milky shadow. The man who had died rose a little stiffly, and then turned into the grove. There was no one at the temple. He went on to his lair in the rock. There the slave men had carried out the old heath of the bedding, swept the rock floor, and were spreading with nice art the myrtle, then the rougher heath, then the soft, bushy heath tips on top, for a bed. Over it all they put a well-tanned white ox skin. The maids had laid folded woolen covers at the head of the cave, and the wine jar, the oil jar, a terracotta drinking cup, and a basket containing bread, salt, cheese, dried figs, and eggs stood neatly arranged. There was also a little brazier of charcoal. The cave was suddenly full, and a dwelling place. The woman of Isis stood in the hollow by the tiny spring. Only one slave at a time could pass. The girl slaves waited at the entrance to the narrow place. When the man who had died appeared, the woman sent the girls away. The men slaves still arranged the bed, making the job as long as possible. But the woman of Isis dismissed them too. And the man who had died came to look at his house. "Is it well?" the woman asked him. "It is very well," the man replied. "But the lady, your mother, and he who is no doubt the steward, watched while the slaves brought the goods. Will they not oppose you?" "I have my own portion. Can I not give of my own? Who is going to oppose me and the gods?" she said, with a certain soft fury, touched with exasperation. So that he knew her mother would oppose her, and that the spirit of the little life would fight against the spirit of the greater. And he thought, why did the woman of Isis relinquish her portion in the daily world? She should have kept her goods fiercely. "Will you eat and drink?" she said. "On the ashes are warm eggs, and I will go up to the meal at the villa. But in the second hour of the night I shall come down to the temple. Oh, then, will you come too, to Isis?" She looked at him, and a queer glow dilated in her eyes. This was her dream, and it was greater than herself. He could not bear to thwart her or hurt her in the least thing now. She was in the full glow of her woman's mystery. "Shall I wait at the temple?" he said. "Oh, wait at the second hour, and I shall come." He heard the humming supplication of her voice, and his fibers quivered. "But the lady, your mother," he said gently. The woman looked at him, startled. "She will not thwart me," she said. So he knew that the mother would thwart the daughter, for the daughter had left her goods in the hand of her mother, who would hold fast to this power. But she went, and the man who had died lay reclining on his couch, and ate the eggs from the ashes, and dipped his bread in oil, and ate it, for his flesh was dry. And he mixed wine with water, and drank. And so he lay still, and the lamp made a small bud of light. He was absorbed and enmeshed in new sensations. The woman of Isis was lovely to him, not so much in form as in the wonderful womanly glow of her. Suns beyond suns had dipped her in mysterious fire, the mysterious fire of a potent woman, and to touch her was like touching the sun. Best of all was her tender desire for him, like sunshine, so soft and still. "She is like sunshine upon me," he said to himself, stretching his limbs. "I have never before stretched my limbs in such sunshine as her desire for me. The greatest of all gods granted me this." At the same time, he was haunted by the fear of the outer world. "If they can, they will kill us," he said to himself. "But there is a law of the sun which protects us." And again he said to himself, "I have risen naked and branded, but if I am naked enough for this contact, I have not died in vain. Before I was clogged." He rose and went out. The night was chill and starry, and of great wintry splendor. "There are destinies of splendor," he said to the night, "after all our doom of littleness and meanness and pain." So he went up silently to the temple, and waited in darkness against the inner wall, looking out on a grey darkness, stars, and rims of trees. And he said again to himself, "There are destinies of splendor, and there is a greater power." So at last he saw the light of her silk lanthorn swinging, coming intermittent between the trees, yet coming swiftly. She was alone, and near. The light softly swishing on her mantle hem. And he trembled with fear and joy, saying to himself, "I am almost more afraid of this touch than I was of death, for I am more nakedly exposed to it." "I am here, Lady of Isis," he said softly out of the dark. "Ah!" she cried, in fear also, yet in rapture, for she was given to her dream. She unlocked the door of the shrine, and he followed after her. Then she watched the door shut again. The air inside was warm and close and perfumed. The man who had died stood by the closed door and watched the woman. She had come to the goddess, and dim lit, the goddess statue stood surging forward, a little fearsome, like a great woman presence urging. The priestess did not look at him. She took off her saffron mantle and laid it on a low couch. In the dim light she was bare-armed, in her girdled white tunic. But she was still hiding herself away from him. He stood back in shadow, and watched her slowly fan the brazier and fling on the incense. Faint clouds of sweet aroma arose on the air. She turned to the statue in the ritual of approach, softly swaying forwards with a slight lurch, like a moored boat, tipping towards the goddess. He watched the strange wrapped woman, and he said to himself, "I must leave her alone in her rapture, her female mysteries." So she tipped in her strange forward-swaying rhythm before the goddess. Then she broke into a murmur of Greek, which he could not understand, and as she murmured, her swaying softly subsided, like a boat on a sea that grows still. And as she watched her, he saw her soul in its aloneness, and its female difference. He said to himself, "How different she is from me, how strangely different. She is afraid of me and my male difference. She is getting herself naked and clear of her fear. How sensitive and softly alive she is, with a life so different from mine. How beautiful with the soft, strange courage of life, so different from my courage of death. What a beautiful thing, like the heart of a rose, like the core of a flame. She is making herself completely penetrable. Ah, how terrible to fail her, or to trespass on her." She turned to him, her face glowing from the goddess. "You are Osiris, aren't you?" she said naively. "If you will," he said. "Will you let Isis discover you? Will you not take off your things?" He looked at the woman and lost his breath, and his wounds, and especially the death wound through his belly, began to cry again. "It has hurt so much," he said. "You must forgive me if I am still held back." But he took off his cloak and tunic, and went naked towards the idol, his breast panting with the sudden terror of overwhelming pain, memory of overwhelming pain, and grief too bitter. "They did me to death," he said, in excuse of himself, turning his face to her for a moment. And she saw the ghost of death in him, and as he stood there, thin and stark before her, and suddenly she was terrified and felt robbed. She felt the shadow of the grey, grisly wing of death triumphant. "Ah, goddess," he said to the idol in the vernacular, "I would be so glad to live if you would give me my clue again." For here again he felt desperate, faced by the demand of life, and burdened still by his death. "Let me anoint you," the woman said to him softly. "Let me anoint the scars. Show me, and let me anoint them." He forgot his nakedness in this re-evoked old pain. He sat on the edge of the couch, and she poured a little ointment into the palm of his hand. And as she chafed his hand, it all came back, the nails, the holes, the cruelty, the unjust cruelty against him who had offered only kindness. The agony of injustice and cruelty came over him again, as in his death hour. But she chafed the palm, murmuring, "What was torn becomes a new flesh. What was a wound is fresh, full of life. This scar is the eye of the violet." And he could not help smiling at her, in her naive priestess's absorption. This was her dream, and he was only a dream object to her. She would never know or understand what he was. Especially, she would never know the death that was gone before in him. But what did it matter? She was different. She was woman. Her life and her death were different from his. Only she was good to him. When she chafed his feet with oil and tender healing, he could not refrain from saying to her, "Once a woman washed my feet with tears, and wiped them with her hair, and poured on precious ointment." The woman of Isis looked up at him from her earnest work, interrupted again. "Were they hurt then?" she said. "Your feet?" "No, no, it was while they were whole." "And did you love her?" "Love had passed in her. She only wanted to serve," he replied. She had been a prostitute. "And did you let her serve you?" she asked. "Yea." "Did you let her serve you with the corpse of her love?" "Aye." Suddenly it dawned on him. "I asked them all to serve me with the corpse of their love, and in the end I offered them only the corpse of my love. This is my body. Take and eat, my corpse." A vivid shame went through him. After all, he thought, I wanted them to love with dead bodies. If I had kissed Judas with live love, perhaps he would never have kissed me with death. Perhaps he loved me in the flesh, and I willed that he should love me bodilessly, with the corpse of love. There dawned on him the reality, the soft, warm love which is in touch, and which is full of delight. And I told them, "Blessed are they that mourn." And he said to himself, "Alas, if I mourned even this woman here, now I am in death, and I should have to remain dead, and I want so much to live. Life has brought me to this woman with warm hands, and her touch is more to me now than all my words, for I want to live." "Go then to the goddess," she said softly, gently pushing him towards Isis. And as he stood there, dazed and naked as an unborn thing, he heard the woman murmuring to the goddess, murmuring with a plaintive appeal. She was stooping now, looking at the scar in the soft flesh of the socket of his side, a scar deep and like an eyesore with endless weeping, just in the soft socket above the hip. It was here that his blood had left him, and his essential seed. The woman was trembling softly and murmuring in Greek. And he, in the recurring dismay of having died, and in the anguished perplexity of having tried to force life, felt his wounds crying aloud, and having tried to force life, felt his wounds crying aloud. In the deep places of the body, howling again, "I have been murdered, and I lent myself to murder. They murdered me, but I lent myself to murder." The woman, silent now, but quivering, laid oil in her hand and put her palm on the wound in his right side. He winced, and the wound absorbed his life again, as thousands of times before. And in the dark, wild pain and panic of his consciousness rang only one cry. "Oh, how can she take this death out of me? How can she take me from this death? She can never know. She can never understand. She can never equal it." In silence, she softly, rhythmically chafed the scar with oil, absorbed now in her priestess's task, softly gathering powder, while the vitals of the man howled in panic. But as she gradually gathered power, and passed in a girdle round him to the opposite scar, gradually warmth began to take the place of cold terror, and he felt, "I am going to be warm again, and I am going to be whole. I shall be warm like the morning. I shall be a man. It doesn't need understanding. It needs newness. She brings me newness." And he listened to the faint, ceaseless wail of distress of distress of his wounds, sounding as if forever under the horizons of his consciousness. But the wail was growing dim, more dim. He thought of the woman toiling over him. She does not know. She does not realize the death in me. But she has another consciousness. She comes to me from the opposite end of the night. Having chafed all his lower body with oil, having worked with her slow intensity of a priestess, so that the sound of his wounds grew dimmer and dimmer. Suddenly she put her breast against the wound in his left side, and her arms round him, folding over the wound in his right side, and she pressed him to her, in a power of living warmth, like the folds of a river. And the wailing died out altogether, and there was a stillness, and darkness in his soul, unbroken dark stillness, wholeness. And slowly, slowly, in the perfect darkness of his inner man, he felt the stir of something coming, a dawn, a new sun. A new sun was coming up in him, in the perfect inner darkness of himself. He waited for it breathless, quivering with a fearful hope. Now I am not myself. I am something new. And as it rose, he felt, with a cold breath of disappointment, the girdle of the living woman slip down from him. The warmth and the glow slipped from him, leaving him stark. She crouched, spent at the feet of the goddess, hiding her face. Stooping, he laid his hand softly on her warm, bright shoulder, and the shock of desire went through him, shock after shock, so that he wondered if it were another sort of death, but full of magnificence. Now all his consciousness was there in the crouching, hidden woman. He stooped beside her, and caressed her softly, blindly murmuring inarticulate things. And his death and his passion of sacrifice were all as nothing to him now. He knew only the crouching fullness of the woman there, and the soft white rock of life. On this rock I built my life, the deep-folded, penetrable rock of the living woman. The woman hiding her face, himself bending over, powerful and new like dawn. He crouched to her, and he felt the blaze of his manhood and his power rise up in his loins, magnificent. I am risen, magnificent, blazing, indomitable. In the depths of his loins, his own sun dawned and sent fire running along his limbs, so that his face shone unconsciously. He untied the string of the linen tunic and slipped the garment down, till he saw the white glow of her white gold breasts. And he touched them, and he felt his life go molten. Farther, he said, why did you hide this from me? And he touched her with the poignancy of wonder, and the marvelous piercing transcendence of desire. Lo, he said, this is beyond prayer. It was the deep, interfolded warmth living and penetrable, the woman, the heart of the rose. My mansion is the intricate warm rose, and my joy is this blossom. She looked up at him suddenly, her face like a lifted, white, wistful, tender, her eyes like many wet flowers, and he drew her to his breast with a passion of tenderness and consuming desire. And the last thought, my hour is upon me, I am taken unawareness. So he knew her, and he was one with her. Afterwards, with a dim wonder, she touched the great scars in his side with her fingertips, and said, But they no longer hurt. They are suns, he said. They shine from your touch. They are my atonement with you. And when they left the temple, it was the coldness before dawn. As he closed the door, he looked again at the goddess and said, Lo, Isis is a kindly goddess and full of tenderness. Great gods are warm-hearted and have tender goddesses. The woman wrapped herself in her mantle and went home in silence, sightless, brooding like the lotus softly shutting again, with its gold core full of fresh life. She saw nothing, for her petals were a sheath to her. Only she thought, I am full of Osiris. I am full of the risen Osiris. But the man looked at the vivid stars before dawn, as they rained down to the sea, and the dog star, green towards the sea's rim. And he thought, how plastic it is, how full of curves and folds, like an invisible rose of dark-petaled openness that shows where the dew touches its darkness. How full it is, and great beyond all gods. How it leans around me, and I am part of it, the great rose of space. I am like a grain of its perfume, and the woman is a grain of its beauty. Now the world is one flower of many petaled darknesses, and I am in its perfume as in touch. So, in the absolute stillness and fullness of touch, he slept in his cave while the dawn came. And after the dawn, the wind rose and brought a storm, with cold rain. So he stayed in his cave in the peace and the delight of being in touch, delicating to hear the sea and the rain on the earth, and to see one white and gold Narcissus bowing wet and still wet. And he said, "This is the great atonement, the being in touch. The gray sea and the rain, the wet Narcissus and the woman I wait for, the invisible Isis and the unseen sun, are all in touch and at one." He waited at the temple for the woman, and she came in the rain. But she said to him, "Let me sit a while with Isis, and come to me. Will you come to me in the second hour of night?" So he went back to the cave and lay in stillness and in the joy of being in touch, waiting for the woman who would come to the night and consummate again the contact. Then when night came, the woman came, and came gladly, for her great yearning was too upon her. For her great yearning too was upon her, to be in touch with him, nearer. So the days came, and the nights came, and days came again, and the contact was perfected and fulfilled. And he said, "I will ask her nothing, not even her name, for a name would set her apart." And she said to herself, "He is Osiris, I wish to know no more." Plum blossom blew from the trees. The time of the narcissus was past. Anemones lit up the ground and were gone. The perfume of bean field was in the air. All changed. The blossom of the universe changed its petals and swung round to look another way. The spring was fulfilled. A contact was established. The man and the woman were fulfilled of one another, and departure was in the air. One day he met her under the trees, when the morning sun was hot, and the pines smelled sweet, and on the hills the last pear blossom was scattering. She came slowly towards him, in her gentle lingering, her tender hanging back from him. He knew a change in her. "Hast thou conceived?" he asked her. "Why?" she said. "Thou art like a tree whose green leaves follow the blossom, full of sap, and there is a withdrawing about thee." "It is so," she said. "I am with young by thee. Is it good?" "Yea," he said. "How should it not be good? So the nightingale calls no more from the valley bed." "But where wilt thou bear the child? For I am naked of all but life." "We will stay here," she said. "But the lady, your mother?" A shadow crossed her brow. She did not answer. "What when she knows?" he said. "She begins to know." "And would she hurt you?" "Ah, not me. What I have is all my own, and I shall be big with Osiris. But thou, do you watch your slaves?" She looked at him, and the peace of her maternity was troubled by anxiety. "Let not your heart be troubled," he said. "I have died the death once." So he knew the time was come again for him to depart. He would go alone with his destiny, yet not alone, for the touch would be upon him, even as he left the touch on her. And invisible suns would go with him, yet he must go, for here on the bay of the little life of jealousy and property was resuming sway again, as the sons of passionate fecundity relaxed their sway. In the name of property, the widow and her slaves would seek to be revenged on him for the bread he had eaten and the living touch he had established the woman he had delighted in. But he said, "Not twice. They shall not now profane the touch in me. My wits against theirs." So he watched, and he knew they plotted. So he moved from the little cave and found another shelter, a tiny cove of sand by the sea, dry and secret under the rocks. He said to the woman, "I must go now soon. Trouble is coming to me from the slaves. But I am a man, and the world is open. But what is between us is good, and is established. Be at peace, and when the nightingale comes again from your valley bed, I shall come again, sure as spring." She said, "Oh, don't go. Stay with me on half the island, and I will build a house for you and me under the pine trees by the temple, where we can live apart." Yet she knew that he would go, and even she wanted the coolness of her own air around her, and the release from anxiety. "If I stay," he said, "they will betray me to the Romans and to their justice. But I will never be betrayed again. So when I am gone, live in peace with the growing child. And I shall come again. All is good between us, near or apart. The suns come back in their seasons, and I shall come again." "Do not go yet," she said. "I have set a slave to watch at the neck of the peninsula. Do not go yet, till the harm shows." But as he lay in his little cove, on a calm, still night, he heard the soft knock of oars, and the bump of a boat against the rock. So he crept out to listen, and he heard the Roman overseer say, "Lead softly into the goat's den, and Lysippus shall throw the net over the malefactor while he sleeps, and we will bring him before justice, and the lady of Isis shall know nothing of it." The man who had died caught a whiff of flesh from the oiled and naked slaves as they crept up, then the faint perfume of the Roman. He crept nearer to the sea, the slave who sat in the boat motionless, holding the oars, for the sea was quite still, and the man who had died knew him. So out of the deep cleft of the rock he said, in a clear voice, "Art thou not that slave who possessed the maiden under the eyes of Isis? Art thou not the youth? Speak!" The youth stood up in the boat in terror. His movement sent the boat bumping against the rock. The slave sprang out in wild fear and fled up the rocks. The man who had died quickly seized the boat and stepped in, and pushed off. The oars were yet warm with the unpleasant warmth of the hands of the slaves, but the man pulled slowly out to get into the current, which set down the coast and would carry him in silence. The high coast was utterly dark from the starry night. There was no glimmer from the peninsula. The priestess came no more at night. The man who had died rode slowly on with the current and laughed to himself. "I have sowed the seed of my life and my resurrection, and put my touch forever upon the choice woman of this day, and I carry her perfume in my flesh like essence of roses. She is dear to me in the middle of my being. But the golden flowering serpent is coiling up again to sleep at the root of my tree. So let the boat carry me. Tomorrow is another day."